Okay, and speaking of Jeremy, I'm going to take a second to introduce a really great student assistant in our office. He's worked with us for about a year now. So Jeremy Sanford will be graduating this year, sadly, but going on to bigger and better things, possibly in Boston. I don't know, you got to fill me in on that, but he's an MUP candidate. So Master of Urban Planning candidate. Going to graduate this semester. Has worked on environmental justice, climate justice, and efforts for our office, and a lot of the information from in this workshop comes from him as well. So, Jeremy, thank you, and we'll hear a little bit more about Jeremy and myself in a second too. So, this is a presentation where we're both going to kind of play off of each other to cover all the information in this. If there's ever any questions, put it in the chat. Otherwise, I think we're good to start rolling here. Before I begin, of course, I want to do a land acknowledgement. We'll talk about that going in a little bit too. So we welcome all members and guests of the University of Buffalo community in order to study, teach, work, and learn. We welcome the respectful exchange of ideas, including those which diverge from our own. We acknowledge the varied lived experiences people bring to our campus, differences that can be caused by discrimination, disparity, and inequity. The land which the University of Buffalo operates is the traditional territory of the Seneca Nation, part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which also includes the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Tuscarora nations. The Haudenosaunee sustained the beautiful lands and waterways of this region long before European colonists arrived here. We acknowledge the harm done by European colonization, by the theft and exploitation of indigenous lands, as well as by subsequent US laws and policies designed to eradicate Native people. Further, we acknowledge the continuing impact of settler colonialism, racism, and discrimination upon indigenous people and upon others who identify with non-dominant racial, ethnic, and/or religious groups of our shared history. This region is home to the sovereign nations of the Haudenosaunee people. The members of the Professional Staff Senate are grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and share ideas in this territory and are committed to working to ensure indigenous futures by affirming indigenous histories, traditions, knowledge systems, and political entities. We'll better educate ourselves in turn promote education and awareness to support the community and well-being of all. Format. We did the introductions. If you missed it, please put who you are, what you represent on campus, what unit you're in, if you're faculty, staff, or student. You can keep that coming. So the point of today, we want to connect sustainability and justice and what our campus can do with some action items at the end. So the learning objectives. So when we talk about sustainability, sometimes we automatically default to environmentalism. And we've started to broaden that definition and incorporating social justice and equity into our work. So understanding how that is integral piece of sustainability. And we're going to briefly take a look at some of our own attitudes and behaviors, and I'll give you some resources to reflect on how we function in our current culture and how we can start changing and shifting our models of behaviors that could be very environmentally unjust. We're going to go through a very basic introduction of environmental justice with a lot of history and context, and then start to take a fairly superficial look at the role higher education has played in perpetuating social injustice and how to break out of that cycle. And then just ways to integrate sustainability and environmental justice in all of our work. So again, this presentation we've used for sustainability professionals across New York State, but we really wanted to broaden that coalition, move outside of sustainability. So whether you're in accessibility resources like Sue or Director of Trademarks and Licensing, hi Cynthia, what our role is on our campus and how we can infuse environmental justice in our work and our thoughts and our processes and how we purchase things, how we eat, how we get here. So one of my favorite ways to get to know people is to ask them their origin story. So Jeremy and I will go through our origin stories and how we got into this field, what excites us about environmental justice and combating it. So brief history about me is I'm from the Binghamton area. So Endicott, New York was home to IBM. when I was younger growing up, my parents would always talk about the plume, and I had no idea what that meant, but it was a toxic plume that's about 300 acres in a neighborhood in Endicott. So that's where my parents are from. But they eventually moved out of that area when I was younger, about 5 minutes across the Susquehanna River to the suburb of Vestal. So long story short, IBM was using chemicals to clean their microchips for their computers, and then dumping all the toxins in the soil, leached up, of course, through the soil into people's basements, into the waterways, and it became a Superfund site, and they're still cleaning it up to this day. So the environmental injustice part of all of this needs a little bit of context. Back in 1980, so this was all found out in the 70s. Back in 1980, the neighborhood they found this plume in was 1% Black. And then in 2000, it's 5% Black. And then currently it's 12% Black. And of that population, 70% is renter occupied. So what that is hinting towards is that the people who could afford to move out of that neighborhood, which were predominantly white at the time, have been renting out those houses to people of color. It's about 14% Hispanic in that neighborhood as well. And all of these percentages are much higher than the rest of Endicott itself. So it's a very concentrated area of people of color and minorities in this neighborhood. So again, wealthy white people were moving out if they could, and renting out their homes to people who may not have known that this is actually a Superfund site or full of chemicals as well. And then there's the legacy of IBM kind of abandoning the area that still hasn't recovered. Yet they tout on their website, they have all these green global initiatives, but they have left kind of this area a little bit desolate. It's about 80% cleaned up currently. So it's still much more work to do. Or in 2017, it was assessed at like 80% cleaned up. Contaminants are still coming up through people's basements, and there's huge ventilation systems attached to houses in this neighborhood still. So that's my origin story. Jeremy, I'm going to push it over to you now.
All right, thank you, Derek. So here's my origin story. As Derek mentioned, I'm Jeremy. I work for the UB Office of Sustainability. And how I got into sustainability a little bit. Originally, I am from California, and Northern California specifically. And I don't know if you've ever been there, but there is this tendency to have to drive on the highway 10 to 20 minutes to get anywhere. So that's kind of shaped my perception of how urban spaces interact with surrounding environments. So where I was, we were near the Sierra Nevadas, so a lot of natural beauty, obviously. Hey, San Francisco, let's go Frisco. But going off of that, I ended up going to college in Wisconsin and getting an appreciation for wildlife in all forms, and also how wildlife interacts with the built environments for human beings. So translating into my grad school program here in Buffalo, really putting a human face to sustainability and green infrastructure, and how we can best offer the benefits of green infrastructure and everything that is involved with it to communities that have historically and currently been left out of those benefits is my passion. So it's really important to express what we mean when we talk about sustainability and just outcomes. So the 7-generation principle is a popular sentiment that originated with the Iroquois tradition, stating that decisions that we should make should consider 7 generations in the future. It's a popular thing to think about in sustainability circles. Also, the Brundtland Commission from the UN in 1987 came up with this definition for sustainable development that you see here. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So this frames everything that we do when we think about sustainable development and extending the benefits of sustainable action to all communities. So along with sustainable development is the concept of environmental justice. So the EPA definition of environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So a core tenet of environmental justice, or EJ, is respecting the lived experience of marginalized groups that have more exposure and more vulnerabilities to environmental hazards as a result of discriminatory policies that were intentional. So lived experience is a big portion of this, and we're going to dive into some of the history of environmentalism in the US and environmental justice as well. So now I'm going to get into a bit of environmentalism and environmental justice, as I said, in the US. So prior to European colonization of the Americas, various indigenous cultures shaped a relationship with the environmental resources that was mutualistic, especially relative to European traditions. It was very mutualistic, non-extractive, and largely need-based. So this is contrasted to the commodification of natural resources that European settlers eventually brought to the continent. Later in the 1800s, ecological sciences were picking up steam, and terms like carrying capacity and analysis of pollution impacts gained a lot of traction. So in addition to this, the US Department of Interior was established, along with early national parks like Yellowstone and organizations like the Sierra Club. Into the 20th century, you had more environmentally focused organizations founded, like the Audubon Society mentioned here, and the Wilderness Society. You also had the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, who was considered one of the first conservationist presidents in the country's history. His time in office was marked by the creation of national park services, or the National Park Service, and expansion of parks across the country. It should be noted that this is often to the detriment of indigenous peoples who frequently protested the taking of sacred and historically owned land by the US government. So that is something that is a present theme throughout the history of the United States, unfortunately, and the environmentalist movement. The mid-1900s were marked by greater recognition of environmental exposures to harms like asbestos, PCBs, CFCs, also the popular pesticide at the time, DDT. So getting into more modern territory of environmentalism and environmental justice, the publishing of Silent Spring by Rachel Carson in 1962 is it's a landmark event in the history of the environmentalist movement, especially the white environmentalist movement in the country. But the book really famously highlighted the ecological devastation as a result of human activity and the negative impacts of DDT specifically. You also have the creation of the EPA, seen here, by the Nixon administration in 1969. And the first Earth Day happened in 1970. And again, to touch on the theme, the first Earth Day, there are many protests across the country from Native American activists who were protesting national park siting on sacred land. So constantly wrestling with this theme of inclusion and justice, even from the early days. In 1970, Nathaniel Hare released his piece called Black Ecology, seen here, which expressed the abuses of the US towards the Black community, the interconnection between capitalism and racism, and the different view of ecological principles and conditions that marginalized peoples have as a result of discriminatory practices against them. In 1971, looking to pop culture, Marvin Gaye released the song Mercy, Mercy Me, off of his famous album, What's Going On, highlighting the growing recognition between the Black struggle in the US and the environmental degradation that was going on at the time. As something closer to home for the Western New York region throughout the 1970s was the outcry over the Love Canal disaster. Here in Niagara Falls, where a former toxic chemical dump site was discovered at the heart of a residential neighborhood. So this became a national media story and is really well known to a lot of people, especially older people in the area. And finally, on this side, we have Warren County, North Carolina. So this was the site of huge environmental justice protests in the 80s, and is considered one of the homes of the environmental justice movement in the US. So predominantly Black and low-income communities in this area were chosen as a location to a landfill in order to store contaminated soil. And the protests pointed to the racial motives for siting across the country, and led to a study by the United Church of Christ that showed that some 60% of Blacks and Hispanics lived in areas that housed toxic waste sites. So getting even more modern with our history here. In 1989, we have the Exxon Valdez oil spill. That was a big story that further showed the need for responsible environmental policies and protections from governmental and private institutions. In 1992, the Rio de Janeiro UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was the first international recognition of the threat of climate change and the need to take action at an international level. In 2001, the Kyoto Protests happened after George W. Bush, the administration, pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol, which is the first global agreement to combat climate change. So you had students, activists showing solidarity with at-risk communities globally, communities that would be most adversely affected by the impacts of climate change and sea level rise. Moving to the 2010s, you have the Flint water crisis, which is very well known. It's all the city of Flint, Michigan, failed to apply corrosion inhibitors to the water supply in the city, led to a lot of lead exposure for predominantly Black and low-income community. And it took a very, very long time to rectify. The city of Flint did not get safe drinking water until 2019. So obviously that is a huge instance of environmental injustice. And 2016 saw the Standing Rock protests. Again, mentioning the indigenous activists that play a crucial point or a crucial part in the environmentalist movement in the country throughout the generations. This is another instance of that. So an 1,100-mile underground pipeline going through indigenous land was proposed, and this was a very well publicized and broadcasted protest from indigenous activists that gained a lot of solidarity from different communities across the globe. Unfortunately, the pipeline was still constructed. It is undergoing environmental review at this point, but it is still very unfortunate and shows the uphill battle that a lot of environmental protests are engaged in. And finally, most recently, we have the global climate strike that I'm sure many here know about or participated in. The global climate strike in 2019 attracted up to 7 million participants in 150 different countries globally. So really highlighting the interconnected nature of a lot of these movements today, especially in the social media age, and the power that young people do have in really demanding change on the environmental front. So it's a very exciting development. I'm going to hand this off to Derek.
Always a jarring slide. So going back in time just a little bit, 30 years, I guess, at this point, HW, so at the Rio de Janeiro summit, industrialized nations were really under fire for their behavior of causing exacerbating climate change. And HW famously declared that the American way of life is not up for negotiations, which basically linked the extractive, irresponsible culture that we have to climate change, right? So he said that we wouldn't change our practice or what we're doing because it's the American way of life. So what is the American way of life? Well, let's get into it. So this power and privilege is based off of a couple of tenets. So talk about classism. So environmental classism is a term created by opponents of environmentalism to stereotype green values. And it's usually as an upper or middle class trend that's too expensive for anybody who's lower class to take a part of. And so environmental racism falls into that too. And it's in particular extreme emotional appeals classifying green as a new whites only club. And it's been like that for a very long time. We still see that play out in a lot of the mainstream environmental field. Just for a little bit of context, like sustainability professionals, there's a very big lacking diversity in sustainability professionals in higher ed. So it's something that our office is very cognizant of and tries to foster mentorship and with students that are people of color to get into our field to change that. So that all leads to this American culture of like owning things is very important. Consumerism, fast fashion, all of that. It's extractive. It's a linear extraction of resources. So never stewarding or regenerative practices really. Gender is a big, big, big lens of our culture. So sexism and gender oppression is not unknown to us, right? So ecofeminism ties this all together, ties the environment and feminism together. So it kind of identifies that we are all connected by recognizing the various forms of discriminations. So racism, classism, feminism, homophobia, xenophobia, because it's institutionalized oppression, right? So Dr. Julia Mason, who is a professor at Grand Valley State University, is quoted in saying, it's believed that there's a social mentality that leads to domination and oppression of women, and it directly is connected to the social mentality that leads to an abuse of the environment, because we have gendered planet Earth or Mother Nature, right? So it's not coincidental that we treat both women and the environment terribly. So, and then race, of course, is the other part of all of this. So racial oppression kind of leads towards saving the Great Lakes places, and stewardship is part of like white supremacy. So holding it into something that's really going back to that ownership principle. I'll put some resources on all of this into the chat, but what it basically all boils down to is that the American way of life upholds white supremacy. So a little bit of a context here. So we're not, when I say white supremacy, I don't really want you to think about blatant bigots and racists that are out there with tiki torches and burning crosses. But white supremacy is the system that we're all functioning in. Our culture was based on that because whites were the dominating, whites were the colonizers, the dominators, and now we're all functioning in the system that's very extractive and very, as we've seen, not great for the environment or the people living in it. So whether you're white or a person of color or somebody who's different, cisgender, or part of the LGBTQ spectrum. So to talk about white supremacy, there's tons of tenets, and there was a great article written by Timo Kuhn and about 30 years ago. And again, I'll put that in the chat. But there are things about there are tenets of white supremacy that really apply to environmentalism. So individualism, the needs of the individual are more than the group. And people should be able to solve their own problems. So if you live in a contaminated neighborhood, you should just move. And it's not that simple, right? If you don't have the money and you've been systematically oppressed to not be able to leave that neighborhood. Paternalism is part of white supremacy. It assumes that people of a different group or community are unable to make good decisions. And it's kind of like that white savior phenomenon. So they just need to listen to me because I'm white and I will show you the way, right? Without recognizing that there's a whole system of oppression that's been built around people of color, and also making decisions without any discussion with neighborhoods or those communities. Neoliberalism says the market will solve solutions, and we know the market has been rigged against non-whites, so or non-heterosexuals or whatever it might be, and it can't really be an answer for these major problems that we have. And then universalism, just kind of white people are guilty of assuming that people who are not white hold the same values, and it's not necessarily the case. And and that we need to educate people who are not holding those values. When in reality, maybe other people's values would be actually better for society all across the board. So there are many more points to white supremacy that I'll like I said, I think it'd be really great if you all digested the article I'm going to put in the chat in a second, and think about how you might be upholding some of these values. Again, I'm not calling anybody white supremacist here, but there are things that are just naturally in your day-to-day job here on our campus that we might stop and think like, well, why are we doing it this way? Or what? There's something about this that is not really correct. So it's probably because it's based in this type of this culture. So we've gave you a huge amount of context and a huge amount of history, and then we talked about some heavy things about white supremacy. So this next exercise, this next part of the workshop is a short 5-minute video where I'm going to ask, it's just going to, I'm going to put the link in the chat. You are going to watch it on your own with your cameras off and take about 7 minutes just to watch the video. Think about what we've discussed, and we'll come back together as a group, which is kind of like your own time to take for yourself in this workshop. Use the restroom. So at about 12:38, the presentation will start again. So just stick around, take the time you need, watch the video. The video is just a summary of what a definition of what environmental justice is. So let me give you all that link. Again, self-guided. I will see you all in about 7 minutes. There's that, and I'll keep putting some resources in the chat too. If there's any questions, just put it in the chat. Signing off until 12:38, 7, 8, 12:38. Okay, pencils down. So that's really just a good video to show that those who do the least harm to the environment bear the brunt of it. So, all right, we're going to get into a couple more tangible things and more pertinent things to who we are as a university and who we are in relation to Buffalo, New York. So I'm going to throw it back over to Jeremy to lead us through the next part.
Yes. Do you have the slide movement here? Thank you. All right, thank you, Derek. So kind of pivoting over to the issue of climate specifically and climate action, there has been rhetoric similar to what we've spoken on before that look to high population growth of low income and Black, Indigenous communities of color locally and abroad as a major driver of the climate crisis that we're seeing. But this is not shown to be the main contributor to global climate change. According to multiple analyses, the highest global earners are estimated to contribute to the majority of carbon emissions currently and in the near future. So an Oxfam study in 2020, for instance, showed that the top 10% of earners globally contributed to over half of all carbon emissions, while the bottom 50% contributed to only 7% of global emissions. On top of this, the richest 5% are responsible for 37% of emissions growth. So you can see where the brunt of the issue is and the responsibility that we have as relatively privileged individuals in the global scene. So looking to solutions for global climate change, Project Drawdown is a nonprofit organization run by researchers seeking to quantify how impactful certain carbon mitigation and climate solutions would be. So this table here shows solutions by rank in terms of effectiveness, shows HFCs, reductions in refrigeration, the building of onshore wind turbines, reduction in food waste, and less meat-intensive diets as the most impactful solutions. So in the top 10, we can really see that many of the solutions that are financially intensive and address issues that the West and global North are predominantly responsible for. So again, that onus should be on the relatively privileged individuals and societies that have contributed to the majority of the climate issue. So two solutions that we do see that are highlighted here that make up the top 10 or are in the top 10 are highly linked and can point to climate mitigation at a different level. So educating girls and family planning. There's a lot of data that shows that educating women is a huge factor in terms of population growth locally and abroad. So while not shown to be a major source of carbon emissions currently or in the near future, in long-term population growth can, if it continues at current trends, can get to be problematic, especially if developing countries now end up having the same emission trajectory as countries like the United States. So it's important to look at these two things that are linked solutions and see how we can tackle climate mitigation at community organization levels as well. So on the issue of top-down and grassroots organization, to bring about climate solutions, this is a diagram that serves as somewhat of a climate change compass. So the top of the compass is high-income perspectives on climate change, and the bottom are lower-income perspectives on climate change. On the left, you see issues, while on the right, you see solutions. So in the upper left, you see polar bear as a representation of climate change perspectives from a higher income standpoint. And while wildlife is super important, like it even contributed to me getting into environmental spaces, this is a relatively detached view of climate change and the problem that we do see. It's very, it doesn't have a human face. So the same can be said to a degree with the solution in the form of solar arrays. So these perspectives are a byproduct of privilege, not really having to deal with the very personal, very localized impacts of climate change and having the financial resources to look to things like solar panels as a solution to the climate problem. So tackling it in different ways is really the focus here. And on the contrary, you see the lower income climate change perspectives you see on the lower left. intensive flooding that destroys human and non-human ecology. So it's a very personal issue for countless people in the US and abroad, from Houston to Antigua and Barbuda. People face the impacts of extreme flooding, elevated exposure to extreme heat, exposure to pollutants, etc. So this is very real, very tangible for people. And you can see finally in the lower right-hand corner, community organization as a solution for the climate problem for a lower income perspective. So both of these perspectives, the lower income and the higher income, are reflective of lived experience, as we touched on earlier. And both, to a certain degree, are legitimate. And our job is to really bridge the divide and make sure that all communities can see the full impact of climate change and have the resources to effectively combat it in ways that best serve their community. Now I want to highlight some examples of environmental injustice that go on in a lot of different areas. So we spoke on Flint and Standing Rock earlier, but other examples include gentrification and the displacement of residents in West Oakland, around where I'm from. So these communities face groundwater contamination, air pollution, as a result of the fragmentation and isolation from services that goes on with gentrification. It is important to note that similar displacement and gentrification occurs right here in Buffalo, New York as well, in historically Black neighborhoods like the Fruit Belt, where the medical campus was put into place. So it's good to be cognizant of things that go on like this in our own backyards as well, obviously. So we can also look to Puerto Rico, where lower income and rural populations were most adversely affected by Hurricane Maria and other natural disasters. And finally, Cancer Alley, as it's called in Louisiana, which is about an 85-mile stretch of more than 150 plants and refineries between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, Louisiana. Mostly Black residents and lower income residents have to deal with the health consequences of elevated exposure to environmental hazards. And that's borne out in elevated cancer rates and respiratory issues. So very real, very tragic impacts of environmental injustice. Other examples of environmental injustices can be seen in the things that we play a very active role in. Fast fashion, as Derek touched on earlier, and the impacts of wasteful production and buying of clothing in a lot of wealthier areas is a big problem. So the treatment of workers producing these clothes is very, very poor, with very, very low, criminally low pay and protections and awful working conditions. So for instance, in 2013, this is something that is talked about a lot. The Rana Plaza garment factory in Bangladesh collapsed and killed 1,100 people. And additionally, 20% of the clothes produced in a lot of these areas are never actually purchased and directly sent to landfills, where the synthetic materials take very long times to decompose and exacerbate the emissions problem that contributes to climate change. And additionally, the impact of wealthier nations, their meat consumption is profound. So animal agriculture accounts for around 60% of the food-related greenhouse gas emissions globally, and the USA leads the world in meat consumption per person. So things that we should be cognizant of, and we can take small steps to really make an impact, make a difference. So our overall purchasing habits have a big risk or impacts on at-risk communities, as we can see. Buying from large distributors like Amazon, Walmart, etc., does perpetuate abuses in the climate and supply chain, ranging from low-paid workers to lack of environmental protections. Additionally, the plastics that we see end up in streams globally where areas are not equipped to deal with the pollution is devastating. So we need to be aware of this and really make small steps to change our habits. So as you can see, environmental injustice is very wide-branching and has many examples globally and locally. Okay. So zooming in a little bit and looking at Buffalo, New York specifically, I want to bring it down to a very local level. So the city of Buffalo is, I'm not sure if you know this, but one of the most segregated racially cities and one of the poorest cities in the country. So the spatial distribution of minority communities into areas where predatory investment takes place and have a lack of basic services was and is an intentional planning decision. And that's meant to prop up the white community in the city. So the devaluation of Black and brown spaces is a necessary component to valuing white spaces. And we should be aware of that. So communities of color in Buffalo have less access to crucial resources like healthcare and nutrient-rich, affordable food. On top of this, these groups have greater asthma rates, as Derek touched on earlier, in the city because they're located in areas where there's greater air pollution near major roadways, and they have less green space to serve as filters to air pollution. To add on this, a community should be able to look to anchor institutions like UB to fight for community justice, but UB has often made matters worse, unfortunately. So I mentioned the medical campus a little bit ago. That has added to gentrification and displacement in the city. And moves like this without broader community investment has really led to tragic outcomes and has shown that UB has not used its influence in the city of Buffalo as an anchor institution effectively to fight for environmental justice. And that can and should change. So I'm going to pass it over to Derek, who's going to talk about institutional level things that we can do.
Yeah, so so a lot of us live and play and obviously work in Western New York, but so there's a lot of things that we can consider in our personal lives on what our interaction with environmental injustices are. We're talking a little bit more about our professional lives here at UB. As I'm talking, feel free to place examples that you might think of in the chat about what higher education's role in environmental injustice is. But there are connections that we can make for higher ed to these issues. So like rising tuition costs, it's expensive to go to college. And I know everybody on this call would probably agree and probably say, costs are too high, but what is our role in combating that? It's kind of above it's a chancellor issue, right? So think about how we can advocate for how we advocate for lowering the cost of education. So as we expand our campus, as we grow our science and technology fields, what that does to our greenhouse gas impact. I'm the person on campus that quantifies all of that. It goes up. So when we have especially with labs, when we're thinking about having our 3 campuses and the commuting patterns through all 3, our footprint will definitely increases due to gasoline and electricity usage. So food insecurity is a big one. About 30% of students, I'm putting some information in the chat, 30% of students have said that they were food insecure. So they struggled to get food in the past month nationally. So UB hasn't done a specific study on that to my knowledge, but that's a national statistic. And then also housing insecurity, and why? Because going to school is so expensive, right? So these are basic needs that are being hard for students to meet. Transportation, parking infrastructure. So again, our commuting patterns, what it does to the neighborhoods that they're situated in. All the traffic to and from the medical campus in the Fruit Belt neighborhood. Air quality is probably pretty poor over there. And then campus placement, gentrification, what it's doing, as Jeremy had talked about in the Fruit Belt neighborhood itself too. And then just who's being represented in all levels of our university, or making sure all voices are heard and given the opportunity to speak where possible. So how do we do this? How do we combat all of this? So again, going back to looking at what our roles and responsibilities are on our campus and using a social justice lens. So thinking about how class, gender, and race can influence your work or have influenced your work, and how you can kind of make sure that it's not that white supremacist culture that we are in. Thinking about who the resources are given to and where they're taken from. So really that thinking about how we do some of our research and how we do community engagement in the neighboring communities that we're in. Is it extractive? Are we asking for data from neighborhoods, but then never following up or never fulfilling some of the visioning that we've done with them? As a former urban planning student, as a graduate of the urban planning program here, I can think of many examples of going into neighborhoods and just being extractive and piecing out and never talking to anybody again. And it's not a great model to work with, and has damaged a lot of relationships. Jeremy, I won't ask you to go into that because you still need that degree. So you share your experience. So, and then, who are most vulnerable members? So not just students, but like staff and people who come to our campus for any reason, thinking about how their needs. So when we think about what happened during the pandemic, who is essential when they had to come to campus, or during a snowstorm, who doesn't have access to reliable transportation to have to get to campus. So making sure that we can support anybody who's vulnerable in our community. So some opportunities. Recently, about 2019, we've updated our climate action plan, and there are 10 strategies to get us to carbon neutrality in 2030. So Jeremy has done amazing work in our office. He's going to highlight a couple of these strategies and its connection to environmental justice as we try to change our operating procedures here on our campus, but also looking at it through a racial lens. So Jeremy, if you want to pop through that real
Yeah,
quick.
definitely. Yeah. Thank you, Derek. Yeah, so one of the areas that a focus that UB can reach its climate goals while fostering environmental justice on campus and in the broader community is through transportation, really. So investments in electric vehicles can be a crucial step in really getting to institutional carbon neutrality, as we all want. But other low-cost initiatives can really be deployed to help along the way as well and foster that environmental justice that we talk about. So public transit access and bike infrastructure improvements can be really good ways to pivot away from greenhouse gas emitting single occupancy vehicles. With this, it's recommended that UB look to offer students an FTA bus pass, as other institutions of higher learning in the city of Buffalo do, to really expand the access to the wider city of Buffalo and get away from the siloed nature of UB right now. Make sure that we have tangible connections to the broader community that can really serve to foster an environment of mutual learning and justice going forward. So UB should partner with organizations like Colored Girls Bike Too, that I've worked with in the past, to help them fight for mobility justice in the community, specifically in the east side of Buffalo, helping them with grant funding options, advocacy work, etc. So these are some of the things we talk about here. Additionally, another major area of focus for UB in the 10 and 10 is the food waste here at the university. So meat consumption, as we talked about earlier, specifically makes up a very large percentage of UB's food greenhouse gas emissions. So offering meat-free alternatives is a really big step that we can do, especially in affordable rates. As Derek mentioned, the food insecurity is a big issue that really predominantly impacts low-income students, especially, and students of color more often. So it's a justice consideration that needs to be at the forefront of our minds in moving towards this solution. So UB can potentially partner with community organizations like the African Heritage Food Co-op, for instance, to get fresh produce to the school, or there are other community organizations, especially BIPOC-led community organizations that offer services that UB can partner with to further enhance the financial well-being of the surrounding community in a localized way. For the issue of carbon pricing, specifically, there are a lot of ways to implement carbon pricing, but one of the most well-known is through air pricing. So we want to make sure that it's not institutionally disadvantaging low-income students and students of color specifically. So there are progressive pricing regimes that can be put in place, for instance, going forward to make sure that those of substantive financial resources and who travel the most really bear the brunt of carbon pricing payments. And a big portion of carbon pricing and net neutrality or carbon neutrality is carbon offsets, obviously. So we want to work in a localized way to make sure that carbon offset partnerships that the university establishes help the local community of Buffalo and those at-risk marginalized communities that we speak about often. So this feeds into the next point, which is working with these groups that foster environmental justice initiatives in the community at the community level. So groups like PUSH, which is People United for Sustainable Housing, offer low-cost home weatherization, for instance, that prepares at-risk residents for the changing climate conditions of Buffalo going forward. So if you have weatherization, you're better equipped to deal with intense winter storms, you're better equipped to deal with the more intense heat that's going to come in the region going forward with climate change. So that's an equity-focused organization that UB can partner with through offset programs, offering students the opportunity to work with community organizations, get experience, and helping out the city of Buffalo and the communities that have been neglected historically. So other organizations work in adaptive green space for the community that improves overall health conditions. So UB can partner with community stakeholder orgs like this to make sure that offsets are tangible and benefit marginalized communities. So again, it's the idea of stepping out of a silo and making sure that justice is a priority on campus and in the wider community, trying to rectify the relationships that UB has built over time with the city of Buffalo. So those are just some of the solutions that we've come up with. But obviously, this is a process that we have to continue to do going forward to make sure that environmental justice is at the core of what we do.
Okay, I know it's 1 o'clock. It's going to be a really quick 2 more slides, I think. So we've talked about the white supremacist culture. So that's a hard action to combat, right? That's a long-term, to break a whole system that that has been built for 200 years, so 200 plus years. Then we also talked about some of the climate action plan strategies that UB is working on, and yes, Cynthia, telecommuting and remote learning is something that we're upholding as a good way to combat commuting, greenhouse gas emissions from commuting. But that's also changing, as many of you know on this call, changing the structure of a state entity is also a long-term process, and we've been working on it for the past 2 years, and we've made advances and some really big announcements coming up soon. So if you haven't RSVP'd for our Earth Day announcement on Friday, please do so. I'll put the link in the chat so you can kind of hear what some of those are. But here are some easy actions that you can take as an individual. So that traditional, like, make sure you're knowledgeable on all these efforts. So read books, read articles, attend trainings, especially about Indigenous practices, know where our roots are here in Western New York. Think about, so charity, especially for small nonprofits, is always great. They're always financially strapped, but make sure you're in solidarity with that work. It's not just donating and then not practicing what you're donating to, or just using that as a get out of jail free card, so you don't feel bad about some of the practices that you do. Be vigilant about the product you use, what's in them chemically, and then who's making them if it's not an extractive workforce. And then, of course, it's all about voting and policy change, just making your voices heard with elected officials. So something a little more applicable here for our campus and our community. Sadie Krat is on this call. I'll give her a second, but let me go through these other 2 tenets real quick. So UB Hired is a clothing resource for students who might not have professional clothing. They can come, it's in our office over here in the Statler building. They can come try on a few outfits that they use for networking or in job interviews. So far, we've had over 100 appointments for for the service. So it's great to see it, and it's been ramping up at the end of the semester because all these students have interviews now. So if you have clothing to donate, please donate that. Please get in touch with us that way. There's also the Food Recovery Network. So if you work with students or you are a student, we have a great group of volunteers that goes into the C3 dining hall, and at the end of every night packages up food that is extra and then donates it to local food pantries like the Response to Love Center on the east side, so that food is not wasted. My mind was blown at how much food is left over at the end of the night. The trays and trays and trays of really good stuff. So I try not to be bitter about how much food we've wasted over the past 100+ years at UB's entity, but it's great that the service is in practice now. So if you have students, we need volunteers for that as well. And I'm sure the students would, if you were interested in see how that works, they'd love to have you join them for recovery. It usually happens about 8:30 at the end of signing services there. And if you're interested in continuing this work at UB, please get in touch with me. I'm trying to pull together a coalition of people that are interested and engaged in this. And I'm happy to give this presentation to your units, or specifically, again, if you can think of other opportunities. But Sadie, if you're still here, would you mind talking about, yes, you are. Would you mind popping on, just briefly talking about the Erie County Climate Ambassador Program for us? So, for those of you who don't know Sadie, by the way, she is an amazing student here at our university and was instrumental in a lot of the environmental and sustainability efforts right before the pandemic hit, right? Like you were the coordinator for the environmental essay. But Sadie's wonderful. I'll let her explain her background here.
Yeah, it was kind of a downer after like 4 years of really good work, and then it was just all kind of put on hold. But got to come back and do the urban planning program. So familiar with some of your comments. But yeah, I actually have a couple of slides if you want me to share them, just because sometimes that's easier with people keeping information. I just need screen sharing privileges if that's cool. But yeah, while that's going on, I'm Sadie. I'm a grad student in the MEP program as well, and I work for Erie County in the Department of Environment and Planning, specifically on the climate action team. And I'm here representing myself and my boss, Tracy, who is our sustainability coordinator at the county. So I've got a few slides. I'm just trying to get to sharing it. I won't like go too in depth, just so people can get the gist of what we're talking about here, because I realize an ambassador program doesn't really make much sense without description of what the ambassadorship is for. But so right now the county's working on their version of a climate action plan, kind of similar to what Derek was mentioning about UBs. So basically, this is our website. I encourage everyone to check it out. But it is an equity-centered community climate action plan, and we're working on identifying actions that we can take to reduce greenhouse gases, both within county departments as well as outside of it. And the initiative was partially funded by the DEC Climate Smart Communities Program, which is like a New York State initiative to outline ways governments can reduce their footprint. So it's a really cool program, and it's community centered. So we're really trying to get people involved who aren't, working for the county. Like we're trying to really work with stakeholders and make it so people have a chance to give, what they would like to see in a plan and problems they've seen or concerns they have. So yeah, New York State passed one of the most aggressive pieces of climate legislation. I know we're all pretty familiar with the CLCPA Climate Act. And yeah, this just as a background, it's a race and class justice centered plan to combat climate change at the county level. And so in part, or in like the same respect as the CLCPA, like the act creates a climate action council to develop a plan to achieve a net zero GHG emissions. So that's kind of what we're aiming for at the county. And it requires 40% emissions reduction from 1990 levels. Because we don't really need to like go into that, but the point is that it's really cool, and we're working with community stakeholders that are involved with nonprofits, government agencies, like municipality level, other county level people, and then there's some people from UB. Susan Clark is involved in it, Chris Rentschler, who is in the geography department. And these are our working groups. So there's 11 of them. And I wanted to highlight climate justice because it kind of goes with what has been the theme of this whole workshop. So there's 11 different working groups, but climate justice is one of the overarching working groups. So basically when any chapter is completed or a goal, a strategy, and an action item is put forth by those stakeholder groups, it has to go through climate justice to make sure it's, addressing all of the problems, all of the people that need to be addressed. Because in the past, things have kind of been put out in a vacuum and not, haven't been taking into account that climate change effects often hit disadvantaged communities hardest. So, one thing that's interesting is the climate justice working group leads, they were given equity training. So when they started, or before they started reviewing materials, basically going through a training on how to best create documents like for that. And they use something called a racial equity tool. So as they're developing outputs, they're making sure that equity is at the forefront of all the committee members' minds. So just some local impacts, why we're doing this. A lot of people think that Buffalo is, free of climate change effects because of our location. And while we are in a very good spot compared to a lot of other places, some things we're seeing and are going to continue to see are flooding from severe storms, increased heat days, or increased hot days from increased heat, and then more invasive species and vector-borne diseases, which can cause problems in Lake Erie with algal blooms and hurting, hurting the ecosystem there, as well as like way more ticks, which can bring long-term diseases like Lyme disease that follow you forever. And isn't great in a time of COVID that goes for those people specifically. So yeah, basically what I wanted to chat about was the ambassador program. So the Climate Ambassador program encourages residents to have conversations and share input about how our community can be healthy, sustainable, and resilient. And through this program, ambassadors will gain knowledge to engage with their communities on topics such as climate change, equity, renewable energy, clean transportation, and can help develop the climate action plan. So I think it's really cool because in the past, we see plans kind of get put out by either government agencies or groups without taking in community input. And, like Derek said, one of the things you learn in planning school is like you are working with communities, you take their data and then you kind of never address them again. And that can be really tough to create sustainable, lasting plans that people want to get behind. So this is a really cool way to get involved with your community because, we're in Erie County, and if you have like a group, or if you know somebody that has a group, you're basically sharing the information I just shared in a lot more depth and gaining feedback. So, knowing how people are being affected from climate change, what you want to see in regards to the climate environment, like in that plan. So I think it's a really cool way to get involved. And we have people from all over the place. I mean, we've got some UB students, we've got some town board members, we have just your local, environmental aficionados. But it's really cool because we have a pretty diverse set of ambassadors, and it's nice to get as much perspective as we can. So if this sounds like something you'd be interested in, and even if you're interested in just hearing about it, feel free to scan the QR code or check out the website to sign up. But yeah, I put my email here. You're also welcome to just email me or just hit me up in the chat, and I can kind of explain it more in detail. But yeah.
Sadie, thank you so much for explaining all that. Just to be clear, is there a deadline to be part of the program, or is it rolling?
So it's kind of rolling. The climate action plan is in the process of being developed right now. It was supposed to be, kind of done by June, July, but it's definitely not being done by then. Jeremy had my job before me, so he knows all about that. And so right now, like for instance, we just put up the agriculture and food systems goal update. So they had a goal it got reviewed, they edited it, and now it is back up. It went up yesterday, so it'll be up until May 18th for public comment. We got the nature-based solutions one up, and that came back to go through the feedback for each of the working groups. So it is happening, and things are going up. Transportation is going to be going up later that week or later this week, but you know, it's moving, but there's still plenty of time to participate in this because things are only in the rough draft stages.
Great, it's exciting. So I appreciate you coming in and explaining all that. So,
yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. All right, so that was a lot to cover. Thank you for sticking around that extra couple of minutes here. If you, Jeremy and I are going to hang around here for just a little bit. So if you have any questions, we're happy to discuss. But otherwise, anything else, you can email me. My contact is DJN2. I'll just type it in the chat. And happy to discuss at another date too. So. Thank you again. Oh, and here's a link to the RSVP for our Earth Day event in the CFA on Friday at 9 o'clock in the morning. We'll have breakfast for you, and just discussion on our climate action plan and how we actually need to advance it and some of the sacrifices or opportunities that we have to get to climate neutrality in our procedures. Good to see you, Lisa. Thank you, Mel. Thank you for coming. Otherwise, have a good day, everybody. Happy Sustainability Month.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Sadie. It's always great to have you hop on.
Yeah, it was good. I also really enjoyed the rest of the presentation. I'm glad I came on at 12 because I thought I had a meeting and then I didn't. So I was like, oh, cool, I can actually join the